Hello and welcome to another episode of the Contract Warrior podcast. I am your host, Christopher Williams. I am a former contracting officer with the Department of Defense. My experience is with cradle to grave contracting, pre-award, post-award, REAs, claims, you name it. Now in this episode, we're going to break down the psychology of a KO and what attorneys must understand to effectively position REAs, claims, and negotiations in federal construction. Now, it's been my experience that when it comes to the federal government, lawyers don't just walk in and talk to the contracting officer. That's not how that works. That's generally done in a claims setting. Now, before a claims setting, if a lawyer wanted to talk to a contracting officer, that's fine, as long as a KO also has legal representation. It's just one of those instances where maybe that agency prefers having a KO with a lawyer when conversing with a lawyer. It's just a courtesy exchange, if you will, of intent and of discussion. So if you're a lawyer listening to this and you think you want to go and call the KO or you want to walk in and talk to them, it's better to set up a meeting, introduce yourself as a lawyer from such and such firm that you would like to discuss this issue. And that KO, what they're going to do is either get you in touch with their lawyer, right, the agency lawyer, or set up a meeting with you and the prime contractor along with the lawyer of the agency, and then have a large partnering to discuss something collectively, right, so that all interested parties who have a big stake in the outcome are present. Now let's talk about your KO and how they're not your opponent, but they're basically a risk manager. They're the different part of the equation, right? So the lawyers are chugging along in regulatory land, and the KO is chugging along in risk management. And now one of the biggest misconceptions that attorneys bring into federal contracting, it's that they view KOs as adversaries. Now this isn't all that common, but it can be common, okay? And that's just not how the KO sees it. In fact, a KO is often asking three simple things. Is this allowable? Is this supported? Can I defend this decision later? Right? Their decisions are not driven by persuasion alone, aggression positioning, or legal pressure. And it's not. The KO is the last person to have those types of decisions that are driven by those type of causes. Because what happens is, it falls back on them, right? The KO is actually signing the difference or putting a signature to paper approving of the decision. So persuasion's not going to help. Aggressive positioning is not going to help. Or legal pressure. It's not going to help. I know this. I was a KO for 17 years. I know it's not. So take that to the bank. It's not going to, which is good because now you know what a KO can't be leveraged with or pushed around with. And now what are they driven by? They're driven by defensibility, okay? If a KO cannot justify a decision within the framework of the contract, regulations like the FAR and DFARs, or maybe agency guidance, and internal review, they won't make it. They just won't. They won't make the decision. And that internal review can include the lawyers. That internal review can include the chief contracting officer. That internal review can also include the local staff, the technical support, right? They're all part of the framework of the contract. Now, this is also regardless of how compelling a legal argument or legal narrative is. I've had contractors try to throw the book at me, per se, with like 5 different clauses in one letter, and none of those clauses even applied. It was somebody administratively trying to be a smart individual who preemptively submitted all these clauses up front as an argument, but they were not demonstrated within the letter. They were just showcased. I don't care. You can put 10 clauses in a letter. That does nothing. That does nothing because you're not demonstrating how those clauses apply and the authority and the nature related. You're just referencing them. Okay, but the next argument is going to be, how do they apply, right? So setting up a legal narrative doesn't always impact the KO So in that example, the contractor, I don't know if their technique or their plan was to persuade me or be aggressive towards me or provide some sort of legal pressure. It didn't work, right? Because I don't know what you're saying. I can send a letter back to you with a bunch of clauses on it as well. There needs to be context. There needs to be phraseology and framing, right? I need to understand where you're coming from. I can't just, shout out a bunch of clauses and just say, there you go. Hey, you owe us money. This clause, that clause, that clause, and that clause. Give us some money. And it is, yes, that generic. It's really unfortunate. That's why I can appreciate lawyers, because lawyers often will look at something like that and say, hey, that's not clear. That's not even a legal argument. That's just, somebody trying to be smart. You can't do that. However, the lawyer might write something that says, hey, because of this clause, we want to do this, this, and that, which is actually premature to the decision of the KO, because the KO might be making a decision differently than that clause, right? So it might be too early to have that conversation. That's the point. The lawyer often will do the lawyer thing way in advance when the issue is still being digested at the KO's level. And that's a concern, right? Timeliness. Timeliness is a big deal. Now let's talk about how the KO thinks in terms of documentation and not arguments, right? So attorneys are trained to build arguments, frame narratives, or persuade through logic and precedent. Makes sense. And they're really good at that. Because of this happened, and here's the outcome, here's the injury, and we're requesting this consideration, right? It's very, very logical. But KOs are trained to evaluate the records, align facts with the contract, and to document decisions for the audit, right? So there is still a workflow, cause and effect, that made this happen, and that can generate strong facts, timeliness, and sometimes dictate authority based on what has happened since, right? And so the KO is identifying very valuable intel that will lay down the foundation to the legal argument. So the difference is critical, right? A claim that is emotionally compelling, legally sound, or well written, it can still fail. If it lacks structure or contract anchored documentation, right? So if there's a compelling argument, sounds beautiful, but the contract has missed, right? There's no contract. There's no anchoring of an issue. There's no workflow. There's no quality control leveling. There's no quality assurance overlap, whatever structure, right? Where did it fail? Where was there a problem? How did this happen? Your argument, just from a lawyer standpoint, with compelling legal beagle angles, it may sound good. It's written very well, but if there's no structure, right, and the contract has not been represented in your argument, or I've talked previously about RFIs as great documentation and also a trend, an anchor point. If your argument doesn't identify those things and it's just identifying, regulations, then it's misleading, or it's not misleading, it's not strong as it could be, right? From a KO perspective, they want you to show where this exists in the contract and show how the facts support it. So where is it in the contract? How do the facts support it? That is your baseline argument. If that connection is weak, your claim is going to be weak, regardless of how strong it sounds. That's the point. So just be clear that, if you have a lawyer who's chewing at the bit to get going and put all this together, but there's no context of the contract, that's a problem, right? And a good lawyer is going to want to have that context of the contract. They're going to want to know what part of the contract was not utilized or was not was overridden, or whatever happened, right? A good lawyer is not going to ignore the contract. A good lawyer is not going to just say, oh, I've done a case like this before. Here's your argument. They're going to still make sure that their argument is sound. Now, generally, before everything gets to a lawyer level, there's already a reasonable amount of documentation identified by the contracting officer, which can also help the lawyer. But just know there's a difference between the lawyer's frame of mind and the KO's frame of mind. It's important. They work together very well as a team when they're on the same team, like when they're communicating very well, because a KO can't really perform as a lawyer, right? And then the lawyer can't perform as a KO. There is a gap. There truly is a gap. And rightfully so. And collectively, right, together, they can build a very substantial argument, whether it's an REA response or a claim response. I've seen it. It's amazing. But first and foremost, there has to be an understanding of a difference in responsibilities and communication, right? So when I'm reviewing a claim document from a KO perspective, my feedback is different than from a lawyer's perspective. So the lawyer might have questions for the KO so that the lawyer can connect the dots legalistically, right? And the KO might have questions for the lawyer regarding the path forward because there's alternative paths given certain clauses or other workflows that the KO might be aware of, and bring that to the attention of the lawyer and ask why can't we pursue it that way? So when you have a good team, this feeds off each other very well. But the point of this episode is to drive home the difference, right? So again, KOs are like, hey, show me where this is in the contract and show me how the facts support it. Now, your contracting officer is going to separate entitlement from emotion. So in many REAs and claims, contractors and sometimes attorneys, I've seen this too, they have a mix of frustrations. They might be upset because the project's been so difficult, right? This has been so difficult to get, to work with the office. Everything's been a challenge. There's this perceived unfairness, right? And it's all written in their narrative. There's all this turmoil and bad actor stuff, right? Things aren't working very well. And the KO essentially will filter all of that out, right? And they're going to focus on, was there a change? Did someone initiate a change, right? Like a constructive change, or maybe somebody gave a verbal, right? Or maybe somehow there was a adjustment to the contract, right? Is it tied to the contract? Contract says this, but we did that. Whatever. Is the cost impact reasonable? We need $1 million. I had a contractor once propose $1 million and they didn't even have support for it. They just said $1 million. So during the negotiation, I asked them, what is that $1 million mark? It's a flat out lump sum of $1 million. What are you doing? What are you asking? And we had to table that. We didn't digest it. I didn't have enough information to digest. I don't know what you're asking for in your proposal. You want an extra $1 million for what? Now, to their credit, they weren't sure how to do it. So we had that discussion and we talked about it, and they were able to reframe it later. It wasn't $1 million, and it wasn't then and now. It was for another time down the road. But that's a good KO. A good KO is going to mentor the contractor to help them communicate to the government. It's not about the KO trying to get the government to get something for $1. Okay, that is not the goal. Nowhere in the contracting officer world is there a training to buy something for $1. That is not how it works, or find the cheapest price. The idea is fair and reasonableness, right? The regulations, implementing the contract, following the contract, and then mediating the contract, right? Mitigation, litigation, all the things, right? Interacting with the contractor, but the contract is what anchors everything. So if there's a change, then there's a change, and there's a workflow for that. If there's an REA, there's a workflow. If there's a claim, there's a workflow for that as well. Those are vehicles within the contract to help make those adjustments, and the KO is the one who's going to sort of drive that into a fair and reasonable outcome. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to give me any feedback, you can head over to contractorko.com and you can give me all the feedback in the world. Tell me I'm doing bad or I'm good, or I enjoy all the feedback. And thank you for your time, and we will see you on the next episode.